And Scott, that misprint in the bulletin is all on me. You read what was written there, Deuteronomy chapter 12. I am not at all prepared to talk about gazelle and deer meat this morning. But I am prepared to talk about Sabbath, which was Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. And that's on me. But I thank you for reading what was there. Amy, you were wondering about that? Maybe some point in my career I will, but not today. Not today. Today I want to talk to you about Sabbath and what's happening here. And I think the key verse that we want to pay attention to understand why I'm preaching about what I'm preaching about, is where Jesus says to the Pharisees that he was upset at their hardness of heart. And I want to talk a little bit about why their heart was so hard. Now, one of the things that Pharisees worked at and tried to uphold all the time was this Sabbath, this keeping of Sabbath. And when the law says that you are not to work and you're not to do anything, but you're just supposed to have this Sabbath day and you're supposed to just keep this Sabbath day holy, well, over the course of time, people have questions about that. And just like in our culture, when people have questions about a law, it goes into a court and it gets further defined and there are rulings on it and it becomes, and then another law is written to help clarify. And this is kind of what happened to this one commandment that God gave. God gave the commandment, you keep a Sabbath and keep it holy. And all these other things meant to clarify what that meant get piled up on top. It even got to the point that they were trying to limit the number of steps that you could take away from your house. And so you could only take, 12 steps away from your house, otherwise it was considered work. But if you needed to retrieve something so that you could continue your Sabbath, you could take more steps. And so what people would do is they would take buckets of water, and they'd walk out 12 steps and they'd place one down. And then they'd go another 12 steps and they'd place another one down. And they'd go another 12 steps and place another one down so that they could be retrieving the water without breaking the law of the Sabbath. And it got to be actually a little bit ridiculous. Pharisees were trying to help folks understand why Sabbath is important, help them clarify the meaning of Sabbath. But when Jesus shows up on the scene, Jesus is to them something they've never seen before. And he's a bit of a threat. Rome is overriding everything. Rome just kind of has its thumb on top of everyone, including the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, because they feel this threat of violence from Rome, that if something goes awry and if people try to get a little too energetic and a little too nationalistic and a little too happy in pursuit of their freedom, that there might be an uprising. And if there's an uprising against the oppressor, then the oppressor, who's got a whole lot more strength than Israel does, is going to unsheath its sword, and that's going to be the end of the people. And so the Pharisees had created this balancing point for that oppressive thumb, and in that created a whole bunch of compromises for their people to adhere to. What oppressors want to do is keep the people they are oppressing from gaining too much power so that they would revolt. That's the goal of oppression. Keep them from being too free. Keep them from being too rich. Keep them from being too connected. Create things that get in the way of empowering people. And then you can keep them under thumb. And the Pharisees were partners in that. Uncomfortable partners. They didn't want that for their people, but they knew that they needed to keep things down just to keep people alive. When Jesus shows up on the scene, he's got people so worked up. He's got people so hopeful that a Messiah is here, and they're thinking that this Messiah is going to raise people up in great revolt against Rome and is going to lead them to victory. The Pharisees are stuck on one mindset and one mindset only, and that is, how do we get rid of Jesus? And so, when this reading comes up, the correct one that I gave you, from Mark, and the first time they're saying, well, the Pharisees are saying, well, how come your disciples are picking grain and eating things that they shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath? The Pharisees are trying to pin Jesus into a public blasphemy so that those in the congregation would hear him say something wrong, and then they could bring a charge against him, and then they could charge him with blasphemy, and that could be the end of Jesus. But Jesus gives them a wise answer, and it frustrates them. You see, they are so focused on getting rid of Jesus. They're so focused on maintaining peace through redemptive violence that they can't recognize that the right thing to do is for hungry people to eat. And neither can they recognize that the right thing to do is for a person who is wounded, for that person to be healed. And here this person comes with a withered hand, and Jesus looks at the Pharisees and he says, well, you tell me, is it work to heal a person on the Sabbath? Is it right to do something on the Sabbath that would lead to life or death? And they were silent because they were so focused on how do we get rid of Jesus that their hearts were hard. Walter Wink talks about this myth of redemptive violence. And here's how the myth of redemptive violence works. Those who pursue redemptive violence think that through violence they can achieve peace. Think that because others are threatening violence, they too must somehow be violent or acquire a measure of violence so that they could keep the threat at bay. It's an idea where peace is simply defined as the absence of open conflict. And so if we can keep our hands on the sheaths of our swords, but our swords at the side and our hearts ready to always be ready to pull it out and slaughter somebody, then we can maintain peace. And when the swords do come out, it never, in the history of humanity, it never holds a peace. Violence always begets violence. Always. The Pharisees are stuck in this myth all by themselves. They are stuck thinking that the only way to maintain the peace of the violent oppressor is to violently get rid of the person that they think is threatening to raise people up in violence. Violence begets violence begets violence. I can redeem the death of one that I love or a member of my gang by killing one that they love or a member of their gang. Is that peace? Is that working for us? Or how about one who's been a victim of domestic abuse? Who's been a victim of violence themselves, and so in order to, whatever's going on inside of them, they choose to be a violent offender of their own. Is that peace? Or when a woman at home lives under threat that if you tell anybody what's going on, is that peace? The myth of redemptive violence gains its power by the number of people and countries who believe it. And so we get fearful. And we say, if this person has that much power and can destroy me this way, then I better acquire that much power at least, so I can at least destroy them the same way. So that way, if they threaten to destroy me, I can threaten to destroy them, and nobody's going to destroy each other, and you live like this. I had a dog that made me live like this. I didn't like it. Autumn, you remember Connor? Connor, our first dog that we had together, was a mix of lab, shepherd, husky, and boxer. And he was a beautiful dog, and he was a strong dog, and he was such an alpha when it came to things. And we were told that if you're gonna have a happy relationship, we paid for a trainer for this dog. You come to our house and help us learn. And we had to live all the time with the ability to give a loud, low no. And the entire time we had that dog in the house and we were working with him, you had to be, just calmly doing something, and you look over at Connor and plug your ears, get ready for this. Are you ready? This is how we actually had to respond to Connor. And just look around and, no! And pretty soon, you're living with a tight gut your whole life. And it's not a peaceful existence. Peace is not the absence of open conflict. Peace is deeper than that, isn't it? Are you happy to be in relationships where there's simply a lack of open conflict? Or would you rather have a relationship where you have mutual respect? Would you rather have a relationship where you have a mutual value for each other's well-being? Where you're just as concerned about the other person being fed and loved as they are concerned about you being fed and loved. Where your worry is not about the violence that can be worked upon each other, but your worry is instead, are you okay? Honest, Vance, are you okay? Because you worry me a little bit. No, I'm just picking on you. I like Vance. That is where peace lies. Peace lies in mutual concern. Jesus says that God gave us a Sabbath for us. The Pharisees were using the Sabbath for them. They were so caught in this myth of redemptive violence that they were taking and twisting the law of the Sabbath for their own means, unable to see that one of the holy things that we can do on Sabbath is make sure that the hungry are fed and that the wounded are cared for. This is a strong challenge. A strong challenge to the ramping up of capacity to do violence that every nation seems to hold to. That makes it so that the criminals think they have to have stronger guns than the neighbors, and the neighbors stronger guns than the criminals, and the police stronger guns than the neighbors and the criminals. The bully on the playground should never be the one who gets to hold their ground. I'll preach about that another time. There was only one time where the myth of redemptive violence was effectively cut off, where there wasn't an equal and opposite escalation between those who were threatening each other. The Pharisees saw Jesus as a threat, but he didn't threaten them. They perceived it as a threat. And so they arranged for his death. Now please, as you hear this story, and whenever you hear somebody talk about Pharisees doing these things to Jesus, please don't think that every Pharisee, this was their end game. That's not true. Pharisees were good servants of the people, but man, when they made a mistake, they made it big. And they made a big mistake by buying into this myth of redemptive violence and choosing to arrange for Jesus' death. And if you ever hear somebody preach that Jesus' redemption came by the violence that was worked upon him, you need to shut that out of your mind. Because our redemption is not by the violence worked upon Jesus. Our redemption is by the grace of Jesus Christ. We are saved by grace, not by violent act. Even when Jesus had the violence being worked upon him, he did not fight back, though he could have called the hosts of heaven to come armed in heavenly light and push them back to sustain his life. He did not. Jesus would not buy into this myth of redemptive violence. Even as he is being nailed to the cross, he looks on those swinging the hammers and holding the steel and says, "What? You're going to get it. Oh, you're going to get it." No. What does Jesus say? "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." When we come together to the Lord's table, remember that Jesus is breaking the pattern of escalation, not buying into this myth that we can be saved or that we can have peace only if we can escalate our capacity for violence. Jesus is instead enduring the worst of the violence that the Roman Empire had to offer, and then beating it through love. Amen? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.